The title isn't clickbait, it's true. As far as I can tell, Sherlock Holmes never once makes an actual proper formal deduction. But how can that be? We see all sorts of examples of Sherlock Holmes deploying his logical genius in order to come to conclusions based on the information he receives. Isn't that what deduction means? No, and that's what we'll explore in this video on reasoning. Deduction, induction, and abduction explained. What does it mean to reason? Usually, reasoning refers to the idea of taking some information and reaching new conclusions. I encounter a piece of toast. I reason it was once bread and that it was transformed into this new entity in a toaster. Sherlock Holmes observes that a woman's wedding ring is significantly cleaner on the inside and concludes that she is a serial adulterer. A lot like me, really. I'm a loyal Weetabix man, but the temptation of Crunchy Nut cornflakes is often too powerful to resist. But in reality, there are actually three different types of reasoning: deduction, induction, and abduction. They're all different and refer to very specific methodologies for taking information and reaching conclusions. And yes, as you've probably deduced by now, even though Sherlock refers to his method as the science of deduction, he never actually employs deductive reasoning in his arguments. To see why, let's go over the three types of reasoning, and we'll start, as always, with my favourite topic: definitions. All reasoning can be stripped into arguments. We have the information given and we have the information concluded. The facts we are given are called the premises, and the premises aren't always obvious to pin down. Back to my toast example, one premise is this is toast. Another premise is bread becomes toast in a toaster. Even though it sounds obvious, that is a fact that we are required to take as true if we want to conclude anything about the toast's origin. So since it's a fact we're taking as true before making any inferences, it is a premise. The fact at the end that we are acquiring as a result of the reasoning is called the conclusion. So in my toast example, we concluded that this was made in a toaster. More complicated reasoning requires multiple steps. So in my Sherlock example, Holmes has the premises: her otherwise dirty wedding ring is clean on the inside. Rings which are clean on the inside are removed frequently. Conclusion: her wedding ring is removed frequently. This then becomes a premise in the next stage of his argument, along with an additional premise: those who frequently remove dirty wedding rings are serial adulterers. Conclusion: she is a serial adulterer. And as a very brief aside, in a mathematical implication P implies Q, we call P the antecedent and Q the consequent, but we'll stick to premise and conclusion in this video. If you want to learn more about mathematical logic, I have a video. Last point before we move on, in general, the number of premises is always greater than the number of conclusions. That's because reasoning generally occurs when we are combining facts together in order to acquire new knowledge. So with that out of the way, let's look at our first type of reasoning: deduction. Here is the key to deduction. The conclusion is always a necessary consequence of the premises. It is impossible to disagree with a valid and sound deductive argument. We'll get to what validity and soundness are in just a moment, but the key really is that simple. Deductions are unarguable, incontrovertible, 100% definitely, actually, factually true. Here is an example of a deductive argument. Premise 1, all apples are fruits. Premise 2, I am eating an apple. Conclusion, I am eating a fruit. The conclusion is inescapable. The majority of deductive arguments take this form. You're basically establishing that one category is a subset of another category, demonstrating that something belongs in the smaller category, and then concluding that therefore it belongs to the larger category. This type of argument with two premises and a conclusion is called a syllogism. And oh, what a word. Perhaps the most famous example of a syllogism is this. Premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, Socrates is mortal. Again, premise 1 establishes that the set of men is a subset of the set of mortals. Premise 2 establishes Socrates as a member of the set of men. The conclusion is that he is a member of the set of mortals. All of mathematical logic takes the form of deductive reasoning. In my video on logic, I looked at the following mathematical implication. X is a multiple of 4 implies X is even. If we wanted to write a deductive argument that uses that implication syllogistically, we would say, premise 1, if X is a multiple of 4, then X is even. Premise 2, X is a multiple of 4. Conclusion, x is even. And what is special about deduction is that the content of the argument doesn't actually matter. Take a look at this one. Premise 1, all multiples of 4 are apples. Premise 2, Socrates is a multiple of 4. Conclusion, Socrates is an apple. As weird as it looks, this is still a valid argument. If the premises are taken to be true, it is impossible to argue against the conclusion. It's the structure of a deductive argument that matters, and it's for that reason, the fact that it's the shape or form of the argument that matters, that this process is part of formal logic. Growing up, I always thought that this was formal logic. We can even make this abstract. Premise 1, everything in A is in B. Premise 2, x is in A. Conclusion, x is in B. We can replace A, B, and x with whatever we like, and as long as the substitution is correct, the argument will still be valid. And that's what we refer to as validity. A deductive argument is valid if the structure is such that the conclusion follows from the premises by necessity. Now, the structure that we've been looking at so far is usually written like this. Premise 1, if A is true, then B is true. Premise 2, A is true. Conclusion, B is true. It's so common that it even has its own name. This structure is called modus ponens. But it's not the only valid deductive structure that's out there. Here's an example of a different structure. Premise 1, nothing in A is in B. Premise 2, X is in A. Conclusion, X is not in B. In practical terms, we might use an argument like this when we're discussing something along the lines of Premise 1, there are no odd multiples of 4. Premise 2, x is odd. Conclusion, x is not a multiple of 4. So validity pertains to the structure of an argument. If a deductive argument is valid, we can't argue with the truth of the conclusion. Except, let's go back to this argument that we had before that concluded that Socrates is an apple. I mean, this must be wrong in some sort of way because we know that Socrates wasn't an apple. Or at least, that's what we suspect. So what's wrong with this argument? How can we challenge a valid argument like this? Well, in this case, we challenge the truth of the premises. A valid deductive argument is such that the conclusion is true so long as the premises are true. But that's if the premises are true, which in this case, they're not. So what we say here is that while this argument is valid, it is not sound. A deductive argument is sound so long as the premises are in fact true. Now, take a look at this one. Premise 1, some mammals are cats. Premise 2, some vertebrates are mammals. Conclusion, some vertebrates are cats. Now this seems like a through and through deductive argument. It's certainly sound because it is the case that some mammals are in fact cats, and it is the case that some vertebrates are in fact mammals, and the conclusion is even true. But this argument is not actually valid. This isn't a valid syllogistic structure. To see why, remember that this argument must be valid regardless of the content of the argument. So to see the flaw in this argument, let's go abstract. Premise 1, sum of B is in C. Premise 2, sum of A is in B. Conclusion, sum of A is in C. But this doesn't follow by necessity. Premise 1 establishes some overlap between B and C. So premise 1 establishes that at least one thing exists in both categories, and premise 2 establishes some overlap between A and B. But nothing can be concluded about the overlap between A and C. It doesn't follow by necessity that something in A is in C. And a quick substitution will reveal the flaw. Premise 1, some carnivores are cats. Premise 2, some humans are carnivores. Conclusion, some humans are cats. And we all know this is wrong, as no humans are cats. At least, that's what we suspect. So, deductive arguments need to be valid and sound to be proper deductive arguments. The only way to controvert a deductive argument is to question its validity or to question its soundness. Validity is usually easy to check, as the argument will take one of a few number of valid forms. More on that in a future video. But soundness can be tricky. Take this argument, which is an active part of atheist-theist debate circles. Known as the Kalam cosmological argument, it attempts to prove the existence of God. Premise 1, everything which begins to exist has a cause for its existence. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, the universe has a cause for its existence. The structure of this argument is completely valid. if the premises are true, we are necessarily required to accept the conclusion. The only refutation must come in challenging the soundness then. Are the premises true? That is it true that the universe began to exist? Or has it always existed eternally in one form or another? Or what about premise 1? Is it true that everything which ever began to exist did so with a cause? Or are there some things which come to be without cause? Another brief aside here, we can also pit the conclusion against the commonly cited aim of the Kalam, which is to prove the existence of a god. But even if the Kalam were valid and sound, and we necessarily accepted the conclusion, all it does is demonstrate that the universe came to be with some cause, nothing about whether that cause is a god. Now, this isn't a video about proving the existence of gods, and I don't claim to prove that one way or another. I'm just bringing this argument up as an example that soundness isn't always easy to verify. Anyway, I hope that gives you a flavour of deduction and why Sherlock Holmes doesn't actually employ deductive reasoning in his arguments. Let's go back to my toast example and write the argument syllogistically. So premise 1, bread becomes toast in a toaster. Premise 2, this is a piece of toast. Conclusion, this became toast in a toaster. This is a sound argument, but it is not valid. A toaster is sufficient for toast, but it is not necessary. There are other ways to make toast, like under a grill or over an open fire, for instance. I used my air fryer to make this one for the express purpose of demonstrating my ability to make toast without a toaster, which none of you would have noticed had I not pointed it out. So I'm pointing it out now because I didn't go to all the effort of using my air fryer just so that you would think I used a toaster like a mere mortal. Who am I, Socrates? And practically every argument Sherlock Holmes employs has this flaw. He makes an observation, he conjectures one way in which that observation can arise, and then concludes that that is in fact how it arose. Or his arguments simply aren't sound. Let's look at that wedding ring again. Presented this way, the argument is valid. But is it sound? Particularly that second premise. Is it true that rings which are clean on the inside are removed frequently? If you think about it, if the ring is always on and pressed against the skin, maybe it isn't exposed to the same levels of dirt as the outside. And it's a similar story with the next stage of the argument. Here we challenge the soundness again. Just look at that second premise. Is it true that one who removes a wedding ring frequently must be a serial adulterer? No, because some people take their rings off every single night, even when they're being faithful. Swimmers often take their rings off every time they go swimming because chlorine can damage certain precious metals. Maybe she's in a consensual, open, or polyamorous relationship and she takes her ring off when she sees other people. It happens. Taking this into account, we could actually rewrite the argument and say, okay, maybe not everyone who frequently removes a wedding ring is a serial adulterer, but surely those who are serial adulterers do remove their wedding ring frequently. We're effectively reversing that second premise. Well, I would still challenge the truth of that second premise, because maybe some serial adulterers keep their wedding ring on when they see other people because the people they're meeting don't care that they are married. And there's an even bigger problem now, and that's that the argument in this form is no longer valid. And it's basically for the same reason that my toast example wasn't valid. We're establishing that the serial adulterers are a subset of the frequent ring removers, we're establishing that the woman is a member of this overset, and then trying to conclude that she must be a member of the subset, which doesn't follow by necessity. So Sherlock's arguments are either not sound or not valid, and therefore since the conclusions don't follow necessarily, it isn't deduction. So let's move on and look at the other types of reasoning now, and they are a little bit different in that the conclusions don't follow by necessity. Does that make them inferior or weaker than deduction? Kind of, but no. Well, one of the reasons I love mathematics is that we can execute this deductive process, and that's because mathematics takes place in a space of idealized circumstances where everything is pure and beautiful and harmonious. But the real world isn't like that. It's muddy and fuzzy. We have imperfect and incomplete information, and we have to make do with the other types of reasoning, which are still very powerful when employed correctly. So let's move on to the next one and look at induction next. Just going to take a very quick break here for some shameless self-promotion. Just wanted to let you know I'm offering my services as a maths tutor. So if you or your child needs support with maths, then allow me to help. I've got 5 years of experience as a classroom teacher. And before that, when I was studying for my PhD, I taught students at the university. So I've taught GCSE, A-level, degree level, whatever exams are coming up for you, I will be able to help you. I've got the necessary background checks, as well as a strong track record of securing good grades for my students. I offer online sessions, or if you're in the Manchester area of the UK, in-person sessions as well. Contact me via my website, drmcgaw.co.uk. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd be happy to help. So, induction. Not to be confused with mathematical induction, which I discussed here. Inductive reasoning is the sort of reasoning used by the sciences. The process can be summed up thusly, forming general rules from specific observations. If we look under a microscope at a skin cell, we see something like this, a blob containing a smaller blob. That smaller blob is what we call the nucleus. A nerve cell looks like this, a bone cell looks like this. All have this blob within blob structure. Using inductive reasoning, we make the following conclusion. All human cells contain a nucleus. We are making a general statement from specific observations. Notice how this is in contrast to deductive reasoning. Here, the conclusion does not follow by necessity, and as we know, not all human cells contain a nucleus because red blood cells don't. Upon observing a red blood cell, we might adjust our general statement by saying something like, all human cells which are not red blood cells contain a nucleus. This is how science is done. Observations are made, and we attempt to find, through inductive reasoning, the overarching rules that explain the observations. These conclusions don't follow by necessity, but we improve our reasoning by ensuring our conclusions are always consistent with each of our observations, and testing our conclusions through experimentation to see if they hold predictive power. Once you're aware of it, you'll notice that you do inductive reasoning in your head all the time. Here were the first 3 general rules about my life that I thought of while writing this video. If I exercise in the morning, I'll feel good during the day. That's because the few times when I've done it, it's felt good. Shopping at a supermarket in the afternoon is better than in the evening. I will enjoy the next film made by Denis Villeneuve. These are all inferences made from repeated observations. The conclusions don't follow by necessity, but as a general rule, inductively, it works. The next stage in scientific reasoning might be to try and find the underlying cause or explanation. Exercise releases endorphins, and they make me feel good. More people are working in the afternoon and not clogging up the supermarket. Denis Villeneuve makes dark and moody, high-concept, introspective films, and I happen to really like that. And my god, just look at that track record. But again, these conclusions don't follow by necessity, so they are not deductions. For example, I might hurt myself exercising in the morning and ruin the rest of my day. An unusually high number of people might just visit the supermarket one afternoon. Denis Villeneuve might just make a bad film. It happens, sadly. Like, I loved every work of David Fincher right up until Mindhunter. Alien 3 doesn't count. And this isn't a video about films, so moving on. There is a name for the idea that the general rule always fits as a result of specific observations. The black swan fallacy. Historically, the term black swan was used in the West to describe an impossibility. A modern equivalent might be something like describing a flying pig, just something that can't happen. When Europeans arrived in Western Australia for the first time and observed actual black swans, the term black swan morphed into a term which meant that supposed facts might later be disproven given new evidence. And hey, maybe one day we'll observe a flying pig, zigzagging our way through the boredom and pain. This is why mathematics is different to science. Mathematics, through deductive reasoning, makes and proves true assertions. Science provides the best understanding given the current evidence, and must always be revised given new evidence. Does that make science feeble and fickle because it can change at any moment? On the contrary, this is the power of science and inductive reasoning. Given new evidence, those general rules and observations are adjusted, thereby strengthening them. Like how when we discovered a red blood cell, we adjusted our general rule about human cells, thereby making it more accurate. Now you will note that Sherlock Holmes never seeks a general explanation for his observations. Holmes is famous for his quick-fire inferences given limited information, like in that example with the wedding ring. He never seeks a general explanation like all wedding rings clean on the inside are worn by serial adulterers. And when I started this YouTube channel, I had no idea I would be discussing adultery so much. There is an observation, an explanation, and that's it. So what is Sherlock Holmes doing? Well, Holmes himself said that once you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth. So Holmes, if he's not doing deduction or induction, must be doing abduction. So let's look at that, but that phrase is fraught with error, by the way, as it often introduces incorrect assumptions. Like, for example, what if Sherlock isn't doing any of the 3 types of reasoning? But anyway, abduction. Abductive reasoning seeks to find the most plausible or most probable explanation for a particular observation. Consider this scenario. I open my curtains in the morning and see that the road is wet. I conclude that it must have rained during the night. This isn't a deductive inference because the following syllogism isn't valid. Premise 1, if it rains during the night, the road will be wet in the morning. Premise 2, the road is wet in the morning. Conclusion, it rained during the night. This isn't valid in structure for basically the same reason that the toast example wasn't valid. We've established that the rain scenario is a subset of the wet road scenario. We've established that we're in the wet road scenario, so it does not necessarily imply that we're in the rain scenario. Rain is sufficient for wet road, but not necessary. Maybe it snowed during the night and then the snow melted into water. Maybe a water pipe burst and sprayed water everywhere. It could happen. It isn't a necessary consequence, so this isn't a deductive inference. This also isn't inductive reasoning, because I'm not seeking to establish a general rule that whenever I observe wet road in the morning, it must be because it rained during the night. Having rained last night is an example of abductive reasoning. Other explanations are possible, but they are not likely. So having rained last night is the most probable explanation. Like if you were to track every single time in which I observed wet road in the morning and measured what they were attributed to, then the fact that it rained last night would account for the majority of those circumstances, and so it is the most probable explanation. Visually, we might adjust our diagram to look something a little bit more like this, with rain really accounting for the vast majority of situations in which the road is wet. So if we observe wet road, then we're not guaranteed to be inside the rain subset, but it is more likely. If I encounter a piece of toast, then through abductive reasoning I conclude that it was made in a toaster. It's not 100% guaranteed, but it is the most likely explanation. That was terrible. And using inductive reasoning, from one specific observation, I'm happy to make the general rule that one should not eat toast made in an air fryer that's been sat on your desk for 4 hours while you've been filming all day. And yes, this is what Sherlock Holmes is doing whenever he makes observations and inferences. In Season 2, Episode 1, he sees dog hair on the trouser leg of an office worker and concludes that the man works at Buckingham Palace. Of course, this isn't guaranteed, because the guy could work in any office and has just encountered at least one dog since he last cleaned his trousers. But Holmes believes that him working at Buckingham Palace is the most likely explanation, and so it is abductive reasoning. A great emotional example of where this goes wrong is in Guy Ritchie's 2009 adaptation. Guy Ritchie, by the way, another filmmaker I liked for his strong but patchy track record until, well. Anyway, here, when Holmes meets Mary for the first time and makes observations and deductions, we see that his conclusions don't necessarily follow. I like this. Holmes's reasoning isn't deduction, and the film acknowledges that and turns it into an effective story beat. This film is actually pretty good, by the way, and features one of my favourite Hans Zimmer scores, so check it out if you haven't already. It's much better than the pretentious Stephen Moffat adaptation, but not as good as the best modern adaptation of Holmes, which is, of course, House MD. Now, abduction has a bit of a weird place among the three flavours of reasoning. It isn't the approach taken by mathematics or philosophy, nor is it the approach taken by science, but I would argue that it is the most practical and pragmatic form of reasoning available to us in our day-to-day lives. We often don't have the perfect ideal circumstances available to us to conduct proper deductive reasoning. So even though abductive reasoning is often formally fallacious under deduction, it often doesn't matter. When I lose my keys, for example, there are always a few places that I look for them first. Under deduction, this is fallacious as it isn't necessary that I will find them there, but through abductive reasoning, it gives me a pragmatic first step for where my keys will likely be. And while mathematics uses deduction, much of the process of doing mathematics uses abduction. Like when I encounter an exam question, through abductive reasoning, I infer what the question is most likely going to be about.
What on earth is going on here? This looks like a groups question. The symmetries of the shape. A rotation, this is groups.
And even doing mathematical research, I made observations and made abductive inferences before seeking to prove them using deduction. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking. Who cares? Isn't this all a bit pedantic? Sure, Sherlock Holmes calls his method deduction, and in common parlance we say deduce to mean come to a reasonable conclusion. Well, to that I say three things. 1, I'm a mathematician, of course I'm pedantic. 2, I mostly just wanted to teach people about the three kinds of reasoning, and Sherlock's methods were a good vehicle for doing that. 3, actually, I do care about this at least a little bit. Science is often stretched in hilariously misguided ways in films and TV shows, and for the most part, I really do not care, as long as it's internally consistent and it's a good story. Do whatever you want. But I do find something slightly insidious about the use of the term deduction and how it has come to mean generally reach conclusions, because there are good reasons why reasoning is divided into these three categories. I listen to a lot of debates, scientific, political, theological, and what I've noticed is that many interlocutors and listeners describe themselves as logical, when actually it becomes clear that they don't know how to construct a logical argument. Claiming that one's arguments are deductive alleges that they are watertight and incontrovertible, when in reality they are abductive at best and are therefore more open to challenge. Logic is very specific, and it's actually fairly unnatural for humans, and more on that in a future video. Logic requires training and practice in order to use effectively. I'm not trying to be elitist here, there's nothing wrong with being untrained in logic, but I think the misappropriation of terms like logical and deduction has led to them becoming synonymous with generally making sense. My hope is not for stories like Sherlock Holmes to totally abandon the use of terms like deduction, just that we all have a little more awareness so that we can recognize things like a deductive argument when they are presented. But that's just me, maybe I'm overly worried about the terminology. Maybe you feel more adamantly that the correct terms should always be used. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one, so let me know down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, don't go anywhere yet. I've got an update to the challenge I set at the end of my last video. I received a lot of partial solutions, so thank you to all those who attempted the challenge and sent me your methods. I loved reading them, a lot of them were really creative. One viewer, I can say, has managed to solve the challenge. Now, I'm not actually going to get into the solution right now, because I haven't decided whether or not to make an entire countdown part 2 video, or just stick the interesting findings and additional questions at the end of another video. But thank you so much to all those who attempted the problem and sent me your partial solutions. I really enjoyed reading them, and I will get the results back to you in one form or another very soon. An enormous thank you to all my patrons for providing such a lovely and supportive community. If you'd like to support me, you'll find a link to my Patreon down below. This has been another proof under another roof, and it has been, dare I say, elementary, my dear viewer.